Welcome, my friends, to a new episode of Frameworks. And in this episode, we're going to talk about teaching literature. And we're going to focus on a wonderful framework for teaching literature. So today we're going to talk about the information-based approach. So let's see how we're going to use the information-based approach in teaching literature. Let's do that. Now, first thing, let's answer a very important question. What do we focus on in the information-based approach to teaching literature? And simply, I would say we focus on information. We focus on content. So the main focus on this approach when it comes to teaching literature is the content of the literary text. That is what we focus on in this framework. So what are the stages and the rationales in this framework? And I would say stage number one, as usual, is leading. And of course, leading is to generate students' interest in the topic of the literary text. So that is the first stage. Now, after leading, we come to a stage that is called reading. And reading is an optional stage. Why do I say an optional stage? It depends on how much time you have as a teacher. So maybe your lesson will last for 1 hour. Then if this is the scenario, you can get your students to read the text in your lesson. What if your lesson is a 45-minute lesson? Then you will ask your students to read at home, and then they will not read in the lesson itself. And that's why I say that reading is an optional stage here. But what is the aim of this stage? It's to give the students the opportunity to read and enjoy the literary text. Right. So stage number one is leading, and stage number two is reading. Now stage number three is text information. And in this stage, your job is to explain the content of the literary text. Because as we said in this approach, the focus is on the content of the literary work. So your job is to explain that. Now, after this stage, we have the information checking stage. And in this stage, we need to check our students' comprehension of the literary work, our students' understanding of the literary text. And the final stage is background information. And in this stage, we're going to provide our students with background information that is related to the literary text. And we're going to explain whatever background information is needed for understanding the text fully. Right. So now it is time to see the information-based approach applied on a real piece of work. And actually I chose for this The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. And the reason why I chose this because this graded reader is actually common in Egyptian schools, and it is taught to secondary school students. So it is something that Egyptian teachers can relate to as well. Right. So let's see how we'll do this. Now let's think about the leading stage. Now, in order to come up with a good lead-in for chapter 1, for example, from The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope, it's very important that you know the content of chapter 1 and you know what topics are being discussed there. So let's read the summary together. So we have Rudolf Rassendel's sister-in-law named Rose, and she urges him to do something useful with his life. And Lord Bilson, Rassendel's brother, tells Rassendel that he's found him a job as an attaché to Sir Jacob Pradale, an ambassador to Ruritania. As the job will only start in 6 months, Rassendel decides to attend the coronation of King Rudolf V, which is to take place in Esterzo, Ruritania. Okay, so mainly here the focus is about finding someone's job, and also look at this, to do something useful with his life, which means that this guy actually is jobless, which is actually the main topic in chapter 1, where we see that this guy comes from a very rich family and he doesn't need to work because he's got a lot of money, and the discussion is about that. So there is here a discussion about the importance of work, and also someone who doesn't work because he's got a lot of money, comes from a rich family. So the idea I decided to use is actually a quote by Samuel Goldwyn. And the quote goes as follows: "The harder I work, the luckier I get." And what I intend to do with this quote, that I'm going to write it on the board, but I'm going to take out the word luckier and put some dots, a gap. So I'm going to say to my students, here is a quote by a producer named Samuel Goldwyn, and he says, "The more I work, the I get." I want you to guess what he said here, and I'll give them some time. And then they're going to compare their guesses with their partners, and they're going to talk together. That would create a discussion. What do you think Samuel said here? They're going to come up with ideas. And then finally, I'm going to say, well, actually, Samuel said, the more I work, the luckier I get. And then I will start a discussion about what Samuel meant by this quotation. And then I'm going to elicit answers from my students. And then, from there we talk about work and the importance of work and how hardworking people can easily become successful and that kind of stuff. After that, I'm going to move from this discussion to a very important question that is so much related to chapter 1 in The Prisoner of Zenda, which is, do people who come from rich families need to work? Why not? Where do they get their money from? And that kind of discussion. And this would get the students really interested in the topic of chapter 1. And that would be what I would do for the leading. Of course, there are so many ideas different from what I said for a leading, but just an example of how I would do this, leading stage in the IBA framework. Good. Now let's move to stage number 2, which is reading. And as I said, it's an optional stage. And if you look at The Prisoner of Zenda, and you look at the graded reader given to students here in Egypt, you will see that chapter 1 is about 11 pages. And if you read it as a teacher, you'll see that one page might take, if you're a bit slow, it would take 1 minute. So let's imagine that 11 pages are equal 11 minutes. But of course, students would not be as fast as teachers. So I would say I'll give 2 minutes to every page for students. And that would be wonderful. So it means that I need 22 minutes or 20 minutes all in all for the 11 pages. So if I have good time in my class, like I'm teaching a 1 hour lesson or 1 hour and a half lesson, then I would go, let them read it here in my class. But of course, if I want to give my students a reading task, I would need to give them some questions to focus on. So when they read, they can answer these questions also, and they can look for the answers. And what I did is that I went to The Prisoner of Zenda, and I found that the school graded reader provides the students with some wonderful questions at the back of the book on chapter 1, and I've got, as you see, these questions here, 7 questions covering the topic of The Prisoner of Zenda chapter 1. So I would say to my students, now you've got 20 minutes, read and answer these questions. And of course, when they finish reading, and I give them the time, I'm going to pair them. Someone might say, Shadi, what if not all the students finish? No problem. I would say, don't worry. We're going to discuss the parts that you missed later. And then I'm going to stress that they need to read what they didn't have time to read in the classroom. They're going to cover it at home. And I'm going to stress on that, right? But once most of the students finished, I'll move on, get them to compare their answers together. And when they compare their answers together and discuss, I'm going to give them feedback. So I'm going to go to question 1, for example, why doesn't Rudolf Rassendyll work? And of course, as a teacher, I have to be ready with the answers. I've read chapter 1. The answer, I have the answers myself. If I want to accelerate this, so instead of me discussing question by question, which would take time with the students, I would be ready with an answer key. And the answer key have the 7 questions with their answers, and I'm going to give the answer key quickly to students to check. And then before I move on, I would say, okay, have you read the answers? Do you have any questions? Would you like me to clarify anything? And that's it. So if they're happy with it, I'll move on to the 3rd stage. Right, good. And what is the 3rd stage? It is actually text information, and I would say it is the most important stage in the framework, because this is the stage in which you will do your job as a teacher. And I recommend for this stage a lecture. Now, someone will say, Shadi, a lecture? I'll say, yeah, lecturing is fantastic. Lecturing is an amazing way of teaching. The reason why many of us in modern teaching hates lecturing is because for some traditional teachers, it's the only way they know. And they didn't even do it well. What do I mean by that? Like, they can spend a whole hour lecturing. But no, this is not the type of lecturing I'm talking about here. I am actually talking about interactive lecturing. So it's only 15 to 20 minute lecture. And how are you going to design this lecture as a teacher? Again, my advice would be sit back home, prepare your PowerPoint slides, and please don't write a lot of information in a PowerPoint slides. No, use the PowerPoint slides as a guide for you. So slide number 1 is just, put a kind of a title and a picture. The title would remind you with what you need to cover for slide number 1. And again, slide number 2, 3. If you put exactly what you will say on slides, that would be unbelievably boring, because you will end up reading from slides, which would render what you say meaningless, because why would you say anything if students can just look at the slides and read? So prepare a very attractive and interesting lecture. How? A lecture is a kind of a presentation. Then you need to have good skills of presenting. And again, you need to learn how to start a very attractive presentation. How to use, for example, shocking facts when you're starting a presentation, how to use effective quotes, how to use wonderful anecdotes that would attract, your listeners. So again, I really advise you as a teacher to read more about presentation skills if you want to go for lecturing. And then go through this lecture covering the content of chapter 1 in The Prisoner of Zenda. But I don't want you to retell the story. I want you to kind of comment on the content of the whole story. Okay, good. And once this stage is over, move to the following stage, which is information checking. So now you presented the information, now it is time to check it. And there are 2 ways of doing this. One way that would be even surprising to you as a teacher yourself, because it's something that you will do on the spot. How? Like, number 1, you will ask your students to write any question they want to ask you about the lecture you have just given. Because remember, we said that you will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes about the content of chapter 1. Now, you will give the freedom to your students to come up with any questions, okay, they would like to ask you about. Then you're going to collect these papers from them, these slips of papers, and then you're going to take a couple of questions from there, put them up on the board. Then look at your students and say, okay, you've got these 2 questions up there. I want you to think about these 2 questions. And when they think about these 2 questions and try to find answers, you get them to work in pairs and discuss their answers to these questions. And then after that, you ask them to share, okay, their discussions with you in the plenary. And then, of course, you start commenting on their answers and correcting their mistakes. Then after that, you ask the students to go back to the literary text and find illustrative quotations that would support their discussions, quotations that would support their answers. And once they do this, again, you'll follow the same thing. They discuss together and then they tell you about the quotations, and then you either confirm their answers or correct, and it goes like that. And if you have time to restart this process, you can ask them to brainstorm again and come up with more questions if they want. And it goes like this. So that's one way of running the information check-in stage. There is another way, which is being prepared. You can prepare everything at home as a teacher before you come to your class. So instead of getting students to write questions that you might not expect as a teacher, you might already prepare questions that would check the information you have given them in a lecture. So, for example, I found this lovely question in a graded reader book given to students at their schools here in Egypt. And as you see, it's a kind of a true and false question, 10 points, and I found them lovely and would be really good in checking students' understanding of the text. So I would give them these questions and ask them to decide which statement is true, which statement is false. And then, of course, they check together, and then after that I give them feedback. And as I said before, if you want to accelerate feedback, you can just give them, a kind of an answer key with the answers, and then give them the opportunity to ask you if something is not clear. Another way of checking question is also this wonderful activity that I found also in a course book, and it is match each item in A with an item in B, and this is also very good for checking understanding of the content. Someone might say, Shadi, do we have to run 2 activities in the information check? And it could be 1, it could be 2. It depends on how much time you have in your lesson. But it could be, yes, more than 1 activity. And then finally, we move to the background information stage. And this needs good preparation from you as a teacher, because you need to read the chapter yourself and underline when you're preparing at home the areas that you feel students would need some background information about. Like what, for example? Like, let's look at question 1 here. Which country is Mauritania today? That's a very good question. Because surprise, surprise, Mauritania is an imaginary country. It never existed. It doesn't exist as well. It's a country that Anthony Hope came up with only for this story. So some students would not know that. They would think that this is a kind of an old country or something. Now, another question is like the second one. How much do you know about the rank duke? Now, students do need to understand what a duke is. What is that? Especially Egyptian students. We don't have monarchy here anymore. We don't have, it's not a kingdom anymore. Terms like dukes, mean nothing here. So you need to tell your students what a duke is and what kind of responsibilities a duke would do. Another question is like this following one. How did people travel from a place to another at that time? And that's a question that I also took from the graded reader book. It's a lovely question because students also need to understand that at that time of the story, people used to travel by trains, you know. And finally, where in Europe is the city of Dresden, which is now that's a real city in Germany. So again, such discussions are important because they will clarify a lot of things about the story. And you can get the students to think about these questions on their own and then compare with their partners, and then finally you give them feedback. So this is, my friends, what we call the IBA framework for teaching literature. And it starts with the leading, and then it moves to reading, and then it goes to information given, or the information staged, or the text information. And then after that, check-in information. And then after that, background information. Thank you so much for watching this episode, my friends. And remember, if you have any questions, don't forget to leave your questions down there in the comments. I'll be there responding to all of you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.